The Underground City, Jules Verne, Part 2, Chapter 6, Simon Ford's Experiment. The old clock in the cottage struck one as James Starr and his two companions went out. A dim light penetrated through the ventilating shaft into the glade. Harry's lamp was not necessary here, but it would very soon be of use, for the old overman was about to conduct the engineer to the very end of the Dochart pit. After following the principal gallery for a distance of 2 miles, the three explorers, for as will be seen, this was a regular exploration, arrived at the entrance of a narrow tunnel. It was like a nave, the roof of which rested on woodwork covered with white moss. It followed very nearly the line traced by the course of the River Forth, 1,500 feet above. "So we are going to the end of the last vein?" said James Starr. "Aye. You know the mine well still?" "Well, Simon," returned the engineer, "it will be difficult to go further than that, if I don't mistake." "Yes, indeed, Mr. Starr. That was where our picks tore out the last bit of coal in the seam. I remember it as if it were yesterday. I myself gave that last blow, and it re-echoed in my heart more dismally than on the rock. Only sandstone and schist were round us after that, and when the truck rolled towards the shaft, I followed, with my heart as full as though it were a funeral. It seemed to me that the soul of the mine was going with it." The gravity with which the old man uttered these words impressed the engineer, who was not far from sharing his sentiments. They were those of the sailor who leaves his disabled vessel, of the proprietor who sees the house of his ancestors pulled down. He pressed Ford's hand, but now the latter seized that of the engineer, and wringing it, "That day we were all of us mistaken," he exclaimed. "No, the old mine was not dead. It was not a corpse that the miners abandoned, and I dare to assert, Mr. Starr, that its heart beats still." "Speak, Ford. Have you discovered a new vein?" cried the engineer, unable to contain himself. "I know you have. Your letter could mean nothing else." "Mr. Starr," said Simon Ford, "I did not wish to tell any man but yourself." "And you did quite right, Ford. But tell me how. By what signs, are you sure?" "Listen, sir," resumed Simon. "It is not a seam that I have found." "What is it, then?" "Only positive proof that such a seam exists." "And the proof?" "Could fire damp issue from the bowels of the earth if coal was not there to produce it?" "No, certainly not," replied the engineer. "No coal, no fire damp, no effects without a cause. Just as no smoke without fire. And have you recognized the presence of light, carburetted hydrogen?" "An old miner could not be deceived," answered Ford. "I have met with our old enemy, the fire damp." "But suppose it was another gas," said Starr. "Fire damp is almost without smell and colorless. It only really betrays its presence by an explosion." "Mr. Starr," said Simon Ford, "will you let me tell you what I have done?" Harry had once or twice observed something remarkable in his excursions to the west end of the mine. Fire, which suddenly went out, sometimes appeared along the face of the rock or on the embankment of the further galleries. How those flames were lighted, I could not and cannot say, but they were evidently owing to the presence of fire damp, and to me, fire damp means a vein of coal. "Did not these fires cause any explosion?" asked the engineer quickly. "Yes, little partial explosions," replied Ford, "such as I used to cause myself when I wished to ascertain the presence of fire damp. Do you remember how formerly it was the custom to try to prevent explosions before our good genius, Humphrey Davy, invented his safety lamp?" "Yes," replied James Starr. "You mean what the monk, as the men called him, used to do, but I have never seen him in the exercise of his duty." "Indeed, Mr. Starr, you are too young, in spite of your 55 years, to have seen that. But I, 10 years older, often saw the last monk working in the mine. He was called so because he wore a long robe like a monk. His proper name was the fireman. At that time there was no other means of destroying the bad gas but by dispersing it in little explosions before its buoyancy had collected it in too great quantities in the heights of the galleries. The monk, as we called him, with his face masked, his head muffled up, all his body tightly wrapped in a thick felt cloak, crawled along the ground. He could breathe down there, when the air was pure, and with his right hand he waved above his head a blazing torch. When the fire damp had accumulated in the air so as to form a detonating mixture, the explosion occurred without being fatal, and, by often renewing this operation, catastrophes were prevented. Sometimes the monk was injured or killed in his work, then another took his place. This was done in all mines until the Davy lamp was universally adopted. But I knew the plan, and by its means I discovered the presence of fire damp and consequently that of a new seam of coal in the Dochart pit. All that the old overman had related of the so-called monk or fireman was perfectly true. The air in the galleries of mines was formerly always purified in the way described. Fire damp, marsh gas, or carburetted hydrogen is colorless, almost scentless. It burns with a blue flame and makes respiration impossible. The miner could not live in a place filled with this injurious gas any more than one could live in a gasometer full of common gas. Moreover, fire damp, as well as the latter, a mixture of inflammable gases, forms a detonating mixture as soon as the air unites with it in a proportion of 8 and perhaps even 5 to the 100. When this mixture is lighted by any cause, there is an explosion, almost always followed by a frightful catastrophe. As they walked on, Simon Ford told the engineer all that he had done to attain his object, how he was sure that the escape of fire damp took place at the very end of the farthest gallery in its western part, because he had provoked small and partial explosions, or rather little flames, enough to show the nature of the gas, which escaped in a small jet but with a continuous flow. An hour after leaving the cottage, James Starr and his two companions had gone a distance of 4 miles. The engineer, urged by anxiety and hope, walked on without noticing the length of the way. He pondered over all that the old miner had told him, and mentally weighed all the arguments which the latter had given in support of his belief. He agreed with him in thinking that the continued emission of carburetted hydrogen certainly showed the existence of a new coal seam. If it had been merely a sort of pocket, full of gas, as it is sometimes found amongst the rock, it would soon have been empty, and the phenomenon have ceased. But far from that. According to Simon Ford, the fire damp escaped incessantly, and from that fact the existence of an important vein might be considered certain. Consequently, the riches of the Dochart pit were not entirely exhausted. The chief question now was whether this was merely a vein which would yield comparatively little, or a bed occupying a large extent. Harry, who preceded his father and the engineer, stopped. "Here we are," exclaimed the old miner. "At last, thank heaven. You are here, Mr. Starr, and we shall soon know." The old overman's voice trembled slightly. "Be calm, my man," said the engineer. "I am as excited as you are, but we must not lose time." The gallery at this end of the pit widened into a sort of dark cave. No shaft had been pierced in this part, and the gallery, bored into the bowels of the earth, had no direct communication with the surface of the earth. James Starr, with intense interest, examined the place in which they were standing. On the walls of the cavern, the marks of the pick could still be seen, and even holes in which the rock had been blasted near the termination of the working. The schist was excessively hard, and it had not been necessary to bank up the end of the tunnel where the works had come to an end. There the vein had failed, between the schist and the tertiary sandstone. From this very place had been extracted the last piece of coal from the Dochart pit. "We must attack the dike," said Ford, raising his pick, "for at the other side of the break, at more or less depth, we shall assuredly find the vein, the existence of which I assert." "And was it on the surface of these rocks that you found out the fire damp?" asked James Starr. "Just there, sir," returned Ford, "and I was able to light it only by bringing my lamp near to the cracks in the rock. Harry has done it as well as I." "At what height?" asked Starr. 10 feet from the ground," replied Harry. James Starr had seated himself on a rock. After critically inhaling the air of the cavern, he gazed at the two miners, almost as if doubting their words, decided as they were. In fact, carburetted hydrogen is not completely scentless, and the engineer, whose sense of smell was very keen, was astonished that it had not revealed the presence of the explosive gas. At any rate, if the gas had mingled at all with the surrounding air, it could only be in a very small stream. There was no danger of an explosion, and they might without fear open the safety lamp to try the experiment, just as the old miner had done before. What troubled James Starr was, not lest too much gas mingled with the air, but lest there should be little or none. "Could they have been mistaken?" he murmured. "No, these men know what they are about. And yet—" He waited, not without some anxiety, until Simon Ford's phenomenon should have taken place. But just then it seemed that Harry, like himself, had remarked the absence of the characteristic odour of fire damp, for he exclaimed in an altered voice, "Father, I should say the gas was no longer escaping through the cracks." "No longer!" cried the old miner, and pressing his lips tight together, he snuffed the air several times. Then, all at once, with a sudden movement, "Hand me your lamp, Harry," he said. Ford took the lamp with a trembling hand. He drew off the wire gauze case which surrounded the wick, and the flame burned in the open air. As they had expected, there was no explosion, but what was more serious, there was not even the slight crackling which indicates the presence of a small quantity of fire damp. Simon took the stick which Harry was holding, fixed his lamp to the end of it, and raised it high above his head, up to where the gas, by reason of its buoyancy, would naturally accumulate. The flame of the lamp, burning straight and clear, revealed no trace of the carburetted hydrogen. "Close to the wall," said the engineer. "Yes," responded Ford, carrying the lamp to that part of the wall at which he and his son had, the evening before, proved the escape of gas. The old miner's arm trembled whilst he tried to hoist the lamp up. "Take my place, Harry," said he. Harry took the stick and successively presented the lamp to the different fissures in the rock, but he shook his head, for of that slight crackling peculiar to escaping fire damp he heard nothing. There was no flame. Evidently not a particle of gas was escaping through the rock. "Nothing!" cried Ford, clenching his fist with a gesture rather of anger than disappointment. A cry escaped Harry. "What's the matter?" asked Starr quickly. "Someone has stopped up the cracks in the schist." "Is that true?" exclaimed the old miner. "Look, father!" Harry was not mistaken. The obstruction of the fissures was clearly visible by the light of the lamp. It had been recently done with lime, leaving on the rock a long whitish mark, badly concealed with coal dust. "It's he!" exclaimed Harry. "It can only be he." "He!" repeated James Starr in amazement. "Yes," returned the young man, "that mysterious being who haunts our domain, for whom I have watched 100 times without being able to get at him. The author, we may now be certain, of that letter which was intended to hinder you from coming to see my father, Mr. Starr, and who finally threw that stone at us in the gallery of the Yarrow shaft. Ah, there's no doubt about it. There is a man's hand in all that." Harry spoke with such energy that conviction came instantly and fully to the engineer's mind. As to the old overman, he was already convinced. Besides, there they were in the presence of an undeniable fact, the stopping up of cracks through which gas had escaped freely the night before. "Take your pick, Harry," cried Ford. "Mount on my shoulders, my lad. I am still strong enough to bear you." The young man understood in an instant. His father propped himself up against the rock. Harry got upon his shoulders so that with his pick he could reach the line of the fissure. Then, with quick, sharp blows, he attacked it. Almost directly afterwards, a slight sound was heard, like champagne escaping from a bottle, a sound commonly expressed by the word puff. Harry again seized his lamp and held it to the opening. There was a slight report, and a little red flame, rather blue at its outline, flickered over the rock like a will-o'-the-wisp. Harry leaped to the ground, and the old overman, unable to contain his joy, grasped the engineer's hands, exclaiming, "Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah! Mr. Starr, the fire damp burns! The vein is there!" Chapter 7. New Aberfoil. The old overman's experiment had succeeded. Fire damp, it is well known, is only generated in coal seams. Therefore, the existence of a vein of precious combustible could no longer be doubted. As to its size and quality, that must be determined later. Yes, thought James Starr. Behind that wall lies a carboniferous bed, undiscovered by our soundings. It is vexatious that all the apparatus of the mine, deserted for 10 years, must be set up anew. Never mind. We have found the vein which was thought to be exhausted, and this time it shall be worked to the end. "Well, Mr. Starr," asked Ford, "what do you think of our discovery? Was I wrong to trouble you? Are you sorry to have paid this visit to the Dochart pit?" "No, no, my old friend," answered Starr. "We have not lost our time, but we shall be losing it now if we do not return immediately to the cottage. Tomorrow we will come back here. We will blast this wall with dynamite. We will lay open the new vein, and after a series of soundings, if the seam appears to be large, I will form a new Aberfoil company to the great satisfaction of the old shareholders. Before 3 months have passed, the first corves full of coal will have been taken from the new vein." "Well said, sir," cried Simon Ford. "The old mine will grow young again, like a widow who remarries. The bustle of the old days will soon begin with the blows of the pick and mattock, blasts of powder, rumbling of wagons, neighing of horses, creaking of machines. I shall see it all again. I hope, Mr. Starr, that you will not think me too old to resume my duties of overman." "No, Simon, no indeed. You wear better than I do, my old friend. And, sir, you shall be our viewer again. May the new working last for many years, and pray heaven I shall have the consolation of dying without seeing the end of it." The old miner was overflowing with joy. James Starr fully entered into it, but he let Ford rave for them both. Harry alone remained thoughtful. To his memory recurred the succession of singular, inexplicable circumstances attending the discovery of the new bed. It made him uneasy about the future. An hour afterwards, James Starr and his 2 companions were back in the cottage. The engineer supped with good appetite, listening with satisfaction to all the plans unfolded by the old overman, and had it not been for his excitement about the next day's work, he would never have slept better than in the perfect stillness of the cottage. The following day, after a substantial breakfast, James Starr, Simon Ford, Harry, and even Madge herself took the road already traversed the day before. All looked like regular miners. They carried different tools and some dynamite with which to blast the rock. Harry, besides a large lantern, took a safety lamp which would burn for 12 hours. It was more than was necessary for the journey there and back, including the time for the working, supposing a working was possible. "To work! To work!" shouted Ford when the party reached the further end of the passage, and he grasped a heavy crowbar and brandished it. "Stop one instant," said Starr. "Let us see if any change has taken place, and if the fire damp still escapes through the crevices." "You are right, Mr. Starr," said Harry. "Whoever stopped it up yesterday may have done it again today." Madge, seated on a rock, carefully observed the excavation and the wall which was to be blasted. It was found that everything was just as they left it. The crevices had undergone no alteration. The carburetted hydrogen still filtered through, though in a small stream, which was no doubt because it had had a free passage since the day before. As the quantity was so small, it could not have formed an explosive mixture with the air inside. James Starr and his companions could therefore proceed in security. Besides, the air grew purer by rising to the heights of the Dochart pit, and the fire damp, spreading through the atmosphere, would not be strong enough to make any explosion. "To work, then," repeated Ford, and soon the rock flew in splinters under his skillful blows. The break was chiefly composed of pudding stone interspersed with sandstone and schist, such as is most often met with between the coal veins. James Starr picked up some of the pieces and examined them carefully, hoping to discover some trace of coal. Starr having chosen the place where the holes were to be drilled, they were rapidly bored by Harry. Some cartridges of dynamite were put into them. As soon as the long, tarred safety match was laid, it was lighted on a level with the ground. James Starr and his companions then went off to some distance. "Oh, Mr. Starr," said Simon Ford, a prey to agitation, which he did not attempt to conceal. "Never, no, never has my old heart beaten so quick before. I am longing to get at the vein." "Patience, Simon," responded the engineer. You don't mean to say that you think you are going to find a passage already open behind that dike?" "Excuse me, sir," answered the old overman, "but of course I think so. If there was good luck in the way Harry and I discovered this place, why shouldn't the good luck go on?" As he spoke came the explosion. A sound as of thunder rolled through the labyrinth of subterranean galleries. Starr, Madge, Harry, and Simon Ford hastened towards the spot. "Mr. Starr! Mr. Starr!" shouted the overman. "Look, the door is broken open." Ford's comparison was justified by the appearance of an excavation, the depth of which could not be calculated. Harry was about to spring through the opening, but the engineer, though excessively surprised to find this cavity, held him back. "Allow time for the air in there to get pure," said he. "Yes, beware of the foul air," said Simon. A quarter of an hour was passed in anxious waiting. The lantern was then fastened to the end of a stick and introduced into the cave, where it continued to burn with unaltered brilliancy. "Now then, Harry, go," said Starr, "and we will follow you." The opening made by the dynamite was sufficiently large to allow a man to pass through. Harry, lamp in hand, entered unhesitatingly and disappeared in the darkness. His father, mother, and James Starr waited in silence. A minute, which seemed to them much longer, passed. Harry did not reappear, did not call. Gazing into the opening, James Starr could not even see the light of his lamp, which ought to have illuminated the dark cavern. Had the ground suddenly given way under Harry's feet? Had the young miner fallen into some crevice? Could his voice no longer reach his companions? The old overman, dead to their remonstrances, was about to enter the opening when a light appeared, dim at first, but gradually growing brighter, and Harry's voice was heard shouting, "Come, Mr. Starr, come, father. The road to New Aberfoil is open." If, by some superhuman power, engineers could have raised in a block 1,000 feet thick all that portion of the terrestrial crust which supports the lakes, rivers, gulfs, and territories of the counties of Stirling, Dumbarton, and Renfrew, they would have found, under that enormous lid, an immense excavation, to which but one other in the world can be compared, the celebrated Mammoth Caves of Kentucky. This excavation was composed of several hundred divisions of all sizes and shapes. It might be called a hive with numberless ranges of cells, capriciously arranged, but a hive on a vast scale, and which, instead of bees, might have lodged all the ichthyosauri, megatheriums, and pterodactyls of the geological epoch. A labyrinth of galleries, some higher than the most lofty cathedrals, others like cloisters, narrow and winding, these following a horizontal line, those on an incline or running obliquely in all directions, connected the caverns and allowed free communication between them. The pillars sustaining the vaulted roofs, whose curves allowed of every style, the massive walls between the passages, the naves themselves in this layer of secondary formation, were composed of sandstone and schistous rocks. But tightly packed between these useless strata ran valuable veins of coal, as if the black blood of this strange mine had circulated through their tangled network. These fields extended 40 miles north and south, and stretched even under the Caledonian Canal. The importance of this bed could not be calculated until after soundings, but it would certainly surpass those of Cardiff and Newcastle. We may add that the working of this mine would be singularly facilitated by the fantastic dispositions of the secondary earths, for by an unaccountable retreat of the mineral matter at the geological epoch, when the mass was solidifying, nature had already multiplied the galleries and tunnels of New Aberfoil. Yes, nature alone. It might at first have been supposed that some works abandoned for centuries had been discovered afresh. Nothing of the sort. No one would have deserted such riches. Human termites had never gnawed away this part of the Scottish subsoil. Nature herself had done it all. But, we repeat, it could be compared to nothing but the celebrated Mammoth Caves, which, in an extent of more than 20 miles, contain 226 avenues, 11 lakes, 7 rivers, 8 cataracts, 32 unfathomable wells, and 57 domes, some of which are more than 450 feet in height. Like these caves, New Aberfoil was not the work of men, but the work of the Creator. Such was this new domain of matchless wealth, the discovery of which belonged entirely to the old overman. 10 years' sojourn in the deserted mine, an uncommon pertinacity in research, perfect faith, sustained by a marvelous mining instinct. All these qualities together led him to succeed where so many others had failed. Why had the soundings made under the direction of James Starr during the last years of the working stopped just at that limit, on the very frontier of the new mine? That was all chance, which takes great part in researches of this kind. However that might be, there was, under the Scottish subsoil, what might be called a subterranean county, which, to be habitable, needed only the rays of the sun, or, for want of that, the light of a special planet. Water had collected in various hollows, forming vast ponds, or rather lakes larger than Loch Katrina, lying just above them. Of course, the waters of these lakes had no movement of currents or tides. No old castle was reflected there. No birch or oak trees waved on their banks. And yet these deep lakes, whose mirror-like surface was never ruffled by a breeze, would not be without charm by the light of some electric star, and, connected by a string of canals, would well complete the geography of this strange domain. Although unfit for any vegetable production, the place could be inhabited by a whole population. And who knows but that in this steady temperature, in the depths of the mines of Aberfoil, as well as in those of Newcastle, Alloa, or Cardiff, when their contents shall have been exhausted, who knows but that the poorer classes of Great Britain will some day find a refuge? Chapter 8. Exploring. At Harry's call, James Starr, Madge, and Simon Ford entered through the narrow orifice which put the Dochart pit in communication with the new mine. They found themselves at the beginning of a tolerably wide gallery. One might well believe that it had been pierced by the hand of man, that the pick and mattock had emptied it in the working of a new vein. The explorers question whether, by a strange chance, they had not been transported into some ancient mine, of the existence of which even the oldest miners in the county had ever known. No, it was merely that the geological layers had left this passage when the secondary earths were in course of formation. Perhaps some torrent had formerly dashed through it, but now it was as dry as if it had been cut some 1,000 feet lower through granite rocks. At the same time, the air circulated freely, which showed that certain natural vents placed it in communication with the exterior atmosphere. This observation, made by the engineer, was correct, and it was evident that the ventilation of the new mine would be easily managed. As to the fire damp which had lately filtered through the schist, it seemed to have been contained in a pocket now empty, and it was certain that the atmosphere of the gallery was quite free from it. However, Harry prudently carried only the safety lamp, which would ensure light for 12 hours. James Starr and his companions now felt perfectly happy. All their wishes were satisfied. There was nothing but coal around them. A sort of emotion kept them silent. Even Simon Ford restrained himself. His joy overflowed, not in long phrases, but in short ejaculations. It was perhaps imprudent to venture so far into the crypt. Pooh! They never thought of how they were to get back. The gallery was practicable, not very winding. They met with no noxious exhalations, nor did any chasm bar the path. There was no reason for stopping for a whole hour. James Starr, Madge, Harry, and Simon Ford walked on, though there was nothing to show them what was the exact direction of this unknown tunnel. And they would no doubt have gone farther still if they had not suddenly come to the end of the wide road which they had followed since their entrance into the mine. The gallery ended in an enormous cavern, neither the height nor depth of which could be calculated. At what altitude arched the roof of this excavation? At what distance was its opposite wall, the darkness totally concealed? But by the light of the lamp the explorers could discover that its dome covered a vast extent of still water, pond, or lake, whose picturesque rocky banks were lost in obscurity. "Halt!" exclaimed Ford, stopping suddenly. "Another step, and perhaps we shall fall into some fathomless pit." "Let us rest a while then, my friends," returned the engineer. "Besides, we ought to be thinking of returning to the cottage." "Our lamp will give light for another 10 hours, sir," said Harry. Well, let us make a halt, replied Star. I confess my legs have need of a rest. And you, Madge, don't you feel tired after so long a walk? Not overmuch, Mr. Starr, replied the sturdy Scotchwoman. We have been accustomed to explore the old Aberfoil mine for whole days together. Tired? Nonsense, interrupted Simon Ford. Madge could go 10 times as far, if necessary. But once more, Mr. Starr, wasn't my communication worth your trouble in coming to hear it? Just dare to say no, Mr. Starr. Dare to say no. Well, my old friend, I haven't felt so happy for a long while, replied the engineer. The small part of this marvelous mine that we have explored seems to show that its extent is very considerable, at least in length. In width and in depth, too, Mr. Starr, returned Simon Ford, that we shall know later. And I can answer for it. Trust to the instinct of an old miner. It has never deceived me. I wish to believe you, Simon, replied the engineer, smiling. As far as I can judge from this short exploration, we possess the elements of a working which will last for centuries. Centuries? Exclaimed Simon Ford. I believe you, sir. 1,000 years and more will pass before the last bit of coal is taken out of our new mine. Heaven grant it, returned Starr. As to the quality of the coal which crops out of these walls. Superb, Mr. Starr, superb, answered Ford. Just look at it yourself. And so saying, with his pick he struck off a fragment of the black rock. Look, look, he repeated, holding it close to his lamp. The surface of this piece of coal is shining. We have here fat coal, rich in bituminous matter, and see how it comes in pieces, almost without dust. Ah, Mr. Starr, 20 years ago this seam would have entered into a strong competition with Swansea and Cardiff. Well, stokers will quarrel for it still, and if it costs little to extract it from the mine, it will not sell at a less price outside. Indeed, said Madge, who had taken the fragment of coal and was examining it with the air of a connoisseur. That's good quality of coal. Carry it home, Simon. Carry it back to the cottage. I want this first piece of coal to burn under our kettle. Well said, wife, answered the old overman, and you shall see that I am not mistaken. Mr. Starr, asked Harry, have you any idea of the probable direction of this long passage which we have been following since our entrance into the new mine? No, my lad, replied the engineer. With a compass I could perhaps find out its general bearing, but without a compass I am here like a sailor in open sea, in the midst of fogs, when there is no sun by which to calculate his position. No doubt, Mr. Starr, replied Ford, but pray don't compare our position with that of the sailor, who has everywhere and always an abyss under his feet. We are on firm ground here, and need never be afraid of foundering. I won't tease you then, old Simon, answered James Starr. Far be it from me even in jest to depreciate the new Aberfoil mine by an unjust comparison. I only meant to say one thing, and that is that we don't know where we are. We are in the subsoil of the county of Stirling, Mr. Starr, replied Simon Ford, and that I assert as if— Listen, said Harry, interrupting the old man. All listened as the young miner was doing. His ears, which were very sharp, had caught a dull sound, like a distant murmur. His companions were not long in hearing it themselves. It was above their heads, a sort of rolling sound, in which, though it was so feeble, the successive crescendo and diminuendo could be distinctly heard. All four stood for some minutes, their ears on the stretch, without uttering a word. All at once Simon Ford exclaimed, Well, I declare! Are trucks already running on the rails of New Aberfoil? Father, replied Harry, it sounds to me just like the noise made by waves rolling on the seashore. We can't be under the sea, though, cried the old overman. No, said the engineer, but it is not impossible that we should be under Loch Katrina. The roof cannot have much thickness just here, if the noise of the water is perceptible. Very little indeed, answered James Starr, and that is the reason this cavern is so huge. You must be right, Mr. Starr, said Harry. Besides, the weather is so bad outside, resumed Starr, that the waters of the loch must be as rough as those of the Firth of Forth. Well, what does it matter after all? Returned Simon Ford. The seam won't be any the worse because it is under a loch. It would not be the first time that coal has been looked for under the very bed of the ocean. When we have to work under the bottom of the Caledonian Canal, where will be the harm?" "Well said, Simon," cried the engineer, who could not restrain a smile at the overman's enthusiasm. "Let us cut our trenches under the waters of the sea. Let us bore the bed of the Atlantic like a strainer. Let us with our picks join our brethren of the United States through the subsoil of the ocean. Let us dig into the center of the globe, if necessary, to tear out the last scrap of coal." "Are you joking, Mr. Starr?" asked Ford, with a pleased but slightly suspicious look. "I joking, old man? No. But you are so enthusiastic that you carry me away into the regions of impossibility. Come, let us return to the reality, which is sufficiently beautiful. Leave our picks here, where we may find them another day, and let's take the road back to the cottage." Nothing more could be done for the time. Later, the engineer, accompanied by a brigade of miners, supplied with lamps and all necessary tools, would resume the exploration of New Aberfoil. It was now time to return to the dockyard pit. The road was easy, the gallery running nearly straight through the rock up to the orifice opened by the dynamite, so there was no fear of their losing themselves. But as James Starr was proceeding towards the gallery, Simon Ford stopped him. "Mr. Starr," said he, "you see this immense cavern, this subterranean lake, whose waters bathe this strand at our feet. Well, it is to this place I mean to change my dwelling. Here I will build a new cottage, and if some brave fellows will follow my example, before a year is over, there will be one town more inside Old England." James Starr, smiling approval of Ford's plans, pressed his hand, and all three, preceding Madge, re-entered the gallery on their way back to the Dochart pit. For the first mile, no incident occurred. Harry walked first, holding his lamp above his head. He carefully followed the principal gallery without ever turning aside into the narrow tunnels which radiated to the right and left. It seemed as if the returning was to be accomplished as easily as the going, when an unexpected accident occurred which rendered the situation of the explorers very serious. Just at a moment when Harry was raising his lamp, there came a rush of air, as if caused by the flapping of invisible wings. The lamp escaped from his hands, fell on the rocky ground, and was broken to pieces. James Starr and his companions were suddenly plunged in absolute darkness. All the oil of the lamp was spilt, and it was of no further use. "Well, Harry," cried his father, "do you want us all to break our necks on the way back to the cottage?" Harry did not answer. He wondered if he ought to suspect the hand of a mysterious being in this last accident. Could there possibly exist in these depths an enemy whose unaccountable antagonism would one day create serious difficulties? Had someone an interest in defending the new coal field against any attempt at working it? In truth, that seemed absurd, yet the facts spoke for themselves, and they accumulated in such a way as to change simple presumptions into certainties. In the meantime, the explorers' situation was bad enough. They had now, in the midst of black darkness, to follow the passage leading to the Dochart pit for nearly 5 miles. There they would still have an hour's walk before reaching the cottage. "Come along," said Simon Ford. "We have no time to lose. We must grope our way along like blind men. There's no fear of losing our way. The tunnels which open off our road are only just like those in a molehill, and by following the chief gallery, we shall of course reach the opening we got in at. After that, it is the old mine. We know that, and it won't be the first time that Harry and I have found ourselves there in the dark. Besides, there we shall find the lamps that we left. Forward then. Harry, go first. Mr. Starr, follow him. Madge, you go next, and I will bring up the rear. Above everything, don't let us get separated." All complied with the old overman's instructions. As he said, by groping carefully, they could not mistake the way. It was only necessary to make the hands take the place of the eyes, and to trust to their instinct, which had with Simon Ford and his son become a second nature. James Starr and his companions walked on in the order agreed. They did not speak, but it was not for want of thinking. It became evident that they had an adversary. But what was he? And how were they to defend themselves against these mysteriously prepared attacks? These disquieting ideas crowded into their brains. However, this was not the moment to get discouraged. Harry, his arms extended, advanced with a firm step, touching first one and then the other side of the passage. If a cleft or side opening presented itself, he felt with his hand that it was not the main way. Either the cleft was too shallow or the opening too narrow, and he thus kept in the right road. In darkness through which the eye could not in the slightest degree pierce, this difficult return lasted 2 hours. By reckoning the time since they started, taking into consideration that the walking had not been rapid, Starr calculated that he and his companions were near the opening. In fact, almost immediately, Harry stopped. "Have we got to the end of the gallery?" asked Simon Ford. "Yes," answered the young miner. "Well, have you not found the hole which connects New Aberfoil with the Dochart pit?" "No," replied Harry, whose impatient hands met with nothing but a solid wall. The old overman stepped forward, and himself felt the schistous rock. A cry escaped him. Either the explorers had strayed from the right path on their return, or the narrow orifice, broken in the rock by the dynamite, had been recently stopped up. James Starr and his companions were prisoners in New Aberfoil. Chapter 9. The Fire Maidens. A week after the events just related had taken place, James Starr's friends had become very anxious. The engineer had disappeared, and no reason could be brought forward to explain his absence. They learnt, by questioning his servant, that he had embarked at Granton Pier, but from that time there were no traces of James Starr. Simon Ford's letter had requested secrecy, and he had said nothing of his departure for the Aberfoil mines. Therefore, in Edinburgh, nothing was talked of but the unaccountable absence of the engineer. Sir W. Elphiston, the president of the Royal Institution, communicated to his colleagues a letter which James Starr had sent him, excusing himself from being present at the next meeting of the Society. 2 or 3 others produced similar letters. But though these documents proved that Starr had left Edinburgh, which was known before, they threw no light on what had become of him. Now, on the part of such a man, this prolonged absence, so contrary to his usual habits, naturally first caused surprise and then anxiety. A notice was inserted in the principal newspapers of the United Kingdom relative to the engineer James Starr, giving a description of him and the date on which he left Edinburgh. Nothing more could be done but to wait. The time passed in great anxiety. The scientific world of England was inclined to believe that one of its most distinguished members had positively disappeared. At the same time, when so many people were thinking about James Starr, Harry Ford was the subject of no less anxiety. Only, instead of occupying public attention, the son of the old overman was the cause of trouble alone to the generally cheerful mind of Jack Ryan. It may be remembered that, in their encounter in the Yarrow shaft, Jack Ryan had invited Harry to come a week afterwards to the festivities at Irvine. Harry had accepted and promised expressly to be there. Jack Ryan knew, having had it proved by many circumstances, that his friend was a man of his word. With him, a thing promised was a thing done. Now, at the Irvine merrymaking, nothing was wanting. Neither song, nor dance, nor fun of any sort. Nothing but Harry Ford. The notice relative to James Starr, published in the papers, had not yet been seen by Ryan. The honest fellow was therefore only worried by Harry's absence, telling himself that something serious could alone have prevented him from keeping his promise. So, the day after the Irvine Games, Jack Ryan intended to take the railway from Glasgow and go to the Dochart pit, and this he would have done had he not been detained by an accident which nearly cost him his life. Something which occurred on the night of the 12th of December was of a nature to support the opinions of all partisans of the supernatural, and there were many at Melrose Farm. Irvine, a little seaport of Renfrew, containing nearly 7,000 inhabitants, lies in a sharp bend made by the Scottish coast, near the mouth of the Firth of Clyde. The most ancient and the most famed ruins on this part of the coast were those of this castle of Robert Stewart, which bore the name of Dundonald Castle. At this period, Dundonald Castle, a refuge for all the stray goblins of the country, was completely deserted. It stood on the top of a high rock 2 miles from the town and was seldom visited. Sometimes a few strangers took it into their heads to explore these old historical remains, but then they always went alone. The inhabitants of Irvine would not have taken them there at any price. Indeed, several legends were based on the story of certain Fire Maidens who haunted the old castle. The most superstitious declared they had seen these fantastic creatures with their own eyes. Jack Ryan was naturally one of them. It was a fact that from time to time long flames appeared, sometimes on a broken piece of wall, sometimes on the summit of the tower, which was the highest point of Dundonald Castle. Did these flames really assume a human shape, as was asserted? Did they merit the name of Fire Maidens given them by the people of the coast? It was evidently just an optical delusion, aided by a good deal of credulity, and science could easily have explained the phenomenon. However that might be, these Fire Maidens had the reputation of frequenting the ruins of the old castle and there performing wild strathspeys, especially on dark nights. Jack Ryan, bold fellow though he was, would never have dared to accompany those dances with the music of his bagpipes. "Old Nick is enough for them," said he. "He doesn't need me to complete his infernal orchestra." We may well believe that these strange apparitions frequently furnished a text for the evening stories. Jack Ryan was ending the evening with one of these. His auditors, transported into the phantom world, were worked up into a state of mind which would believe anything. All at once shouts were heard outside. Jack Ryan stopped short in the middle of his story, and all rushed out of the barn. The night was pitchy dark. Squalls of wind and rain swept along the beach. 2 or 3 fishermen, their backs against a rock, the better to resist the wind, were shouting at the top of their voices. Jack Ryan and his companions ran up to them. The shouts were, however, not for the inhabitants of the farm, but to warn men who, without being aware of it, were going to destruction. A dark, confused mass appeared some way out at sea. It was a vessel whose position could be seen by her lights, for she carried a white one on her foremast, a green on the starboard side, and a red on the outside. She was evidently running straight on the rocks. "A ship in distress?" said Ryan. "Aye," answered one of the fishermen, "and now they want to tack, but it's too late." "Do they want to run ashore?" said another. "It seems so," responded one of the fishermen, "unless he has been misled by some." The man was interrupted by a yell from Jack. Could the crew have heard it? At any rate, it was too late for them to beat back from the line of breakers which gleamed white in the darkness. But it was not, as might be supposed, a last effort of Ryan's to warn the doomed ship. He now had his back to the sea. His companions turned also and gazed at a spot situated about 1/2 mile inland. It was Dundonald Castle. A long flame twisted and bent under the gale on the summit of the old tower. "The Fire Maiden!" cried the superstitious men in terror. Clearly, it needed a good, strong imagination to find any human likeness in that flame. Waving in the wind like a luminous flag, it seemed sometimes to fly round the tower, as if it was just going out, and a moment after it was seen again dancing on its blue point. "The Fire Maiden! The Fire Maiden!" cried the terrified fishermen and peasants. All was then explained. The ship, having lost her reckoning in the fog, had taken this flame on the top of Dundonald Castle for the Irvine light. She thought herself at the entrance of the Firth, 10 miles to the north, when she was really running on a shore which offered no refuge. What could be done to save her, if there was still time? It was too late. A frightful crash was heard above the tumult of the elements. The vessel had struck. The white line of surf was broken for an instant. She heeled over on her side and lay among the rocks. At the same time, by a strange coincidence, the long flame disappeared as if it had been swept away by a violent gust. Earth, sea, and sky were plunged in complete darkness. "The Fire Maiden!" shouted Ryan, for the last time, as the apparition, which he and his companions believed supernatural, disappeared. But then the courage of these superstitious Scotchmen, which had failed before a fancied danger, returned in face of a real one, which they were ready to brave in order to save their fellow creatures. The tempest did not deter them. As heroic as they had before been credulous, fastening ropes round their waists, they rushed into the waves to the aid of those on the wreck. Happily, they succeeded in their endeavours, although some, and bold Jack Ryan was among the number, were severely wounded on the rocks. But the captain of the vessel and the 8 sailors who composed his crew were hauled up, safe and sound, on the beach. The ship was the Norwegian brig Motala, laden with timber and bound for Glasgow. Of the Motala herself, nothing remained but a few spars, washed up by the waves and dashed among the rocks on the beach. Jack Ryan and 3 of his companions, wounded like himself, were carried into a room of Melrose Farm, where every care was lavished on them. Ryan was the most hurt, for when with the rope round his waist he had rushed into the sea, the waves had almost immediately dashed him back against the rocks. He was brought, indeed, very nearly lifeless onto the beach. The brave fellow was therefore confined to bed for several days, to his great disgust. However, as soon as he was given permission to sing as much as he liked, he bore his trouble patiently, and the farm echoed all day with his jovial voice. But from this adventure he imbibed a more lively sentiment of fear with regard to brownies and other goblins who amuse themselves by plaguing mankind, and he made them responsible for the catastrophe of the Motala. It would have been vain to try and convince him that the Fire Maidens did not exist, and that the flame, so suddenly appearing among the ruins, was but a natural phenomenon. No reasoning could make him believe it. His companions were, if possible, more obstinate than he in their credulity. According to them, one of the Fire Maidens had maliciously attracted the Motala to the coast. As to wishing to punish her, as well try to bring the tempest to justice. The magistrates might order what arrests they pleased, but a flame cannot be imprisoned, an impalpable being can't be handcuffed. It must be acknowledged that the researches which were ultimately made gave ground, at least in appearance, to this superstitious way of explaining the facts. The inquiry was made with great care. Officials came to Dundonald Castle, and they proceeded to conduct a most vigorous search. The magistrate wished first to ascertain if the ground bore any footprints which could be attributed to other than goblins' feet. It was impossible to find the least trace, whether old or new. Moreover, the earth, still damp from the rain of the day before, would have preserved the least vestige. The result of all this was that the magistrates only got for their trouble a new legend added to so many others, a legend which would be perpetuated by the remembrance of the catastrophe of the Motala, and indisputably confirm the truth of the apparition of the Fire Maidens. A hearty fellow like Jack Ryan, with so strong a constitution, could not be long confined to his bed. A few sprains and bruises were not quite enough to keep him on his back longer than he liked. He had not time to be ill. Jack, therefore, soon got well. As soon as he was on his legs again, before resuming his work on the farm, he wished to go and visit his friend Harry, and learn why he had not come to the Irvine merrymaking. He could not understand his absence, for Harry was not a man who would willingly promise and not perform. It was unlikely, too, that the son of the old overman had not heard of the wreck of the Motala, as it was in all the papers. He must know the part Jack had taken in it and what had happened to him, and it was unlike Harry not to hasten to the farm and see how his old chum was going on. As Harry had not come, there must have been something to prevent him. Jack Ryan would as soon deny the existence of the Fire Maidens as believe in Harry's indifference. 2 days after the catastrophe, Jack left the farm merrily, feeling nothing of his wounds. Singing in the fullness of his heart, he awoke the echoes of the cliff as he walked to the station of the railway, which via Glasgow would take him to Stirling and Callander. As he was waiting for his train, his attention was attracted by a bill posted up on the walls containing the following notice. On the 4th of December, the engineer, James Starr, of Edinburgh, embarked from Granton Pier on board the Prince of Wales. He disembarked the same day at Stirling. From that time, nothing further has been heard of him. Any information concerning him is requested to be sent to the President of the Royal Institution, Edinburgh. Jack Ryan, stopping before one of these advertisements, read it twice over with extreme surprise. Mr. Starr, he exclaimed. Why, on the 4th of December, I met him with Harry on the ladder of the Dochart pit. That was 10 days ago, and he has not been seen from that time. That explains why my chum didn't come to Irvine. And without taking time to inform the president of the Royal Institution by letter what he knew relative to James Starr, Jack jumped into the train, determining to go first of all to the Yarrow shaft. There he would descend to the depths of the pit, if necessary, to find Harry, and with him was sure to be the engineer James Starr. "They haven't turned up again," said he to himself. "Why? Has anything prevented them? Could any work of importance keep them still at the bottom of the mine? I must find out." And Ryan, hastening his steps, arrived in less than an hour at the Yarrow shaft. Externally, nothing was changed. The same silence around. Not a living creature was moving in that desert region. Jack entered the ruined shed which covered the opening of the shaft. He gazed down into the dark abyss. Nothing was to be seen. He listened. Nothing was to be heard. "And my lamp," he exclaimed. "Suppose it isn't in its place." The lamp which Ryan used when he visited the pit was usually deposited in a corner near the landing of the topmost ladder. It had disappeared. "Here is a nuisance," said Jack, beginning to feel rather uneasy. Then, without hesitating, superstitious though he was, "I will go," said he, "though it's as dark down there as in the lowest depths of the infernal regions." And he began to descend the long flight of ladders which led down the gloomy shaft. Jack Ryan had not forgotten his old mining habits, and he was well acquainted with the Dochart pit, or he would scarcely have dared to venture thus. He went very carefully, however. His foot tried each round, as some of them were worm-eaten. A false step would entail a deadly fall through this space of 1,500 feet. He counted each landing as he passed it, knowing that he could not reach the bottom of the shaft until he had left the 30th. Once there, he would have no trouble, so he thought, in finding the cottage, built, as we have said, at the extremity of the principal passage. Jack Ryan went on thus until he got to the 26th landing, and consequently had 200 feet between him and the bottom. Here he put down his leg to feel for the first rung of the 27th ladder, but his foot swinging in space found nothing to rest on. He knelt down and felt about with his hand for the top of the ladder. It was in vain. "Old Nick himself must have been down this way," said Jack, not without a slight feeling of terror. He stood considering for some time, with folded arms, and longing to be able to pierce the impenetrable darkness. Then it occurred to him that if he could not get down, neither could the inhabitants of the mine get up. There was now no communication between the depths of the pit and the upper regions. If the removal of the lower ladders of the Yarrow shaft had been effected since his last visit to the cottage, what had become of Simon Ford, his wife, his son, and the engineer? The prolonged absence of James Starr proved that he had not left the pit since the day Ryan met with him in the shaft. How had the cottage been provisioned since then? The food of these unfortunate people, imprisoned 1,500 feet below the surface of the ground, must have been exhausted by this time. All this passed through Jack's mind as he saw that by himself he could do nothing to get to the cottage. He had no doubt but that communication had been interrupted with a malevolent intention. At any rate, the authorities must be informed, and that as soon as possible. Jack Ryan bent forward from the landing. "Harry! Harry!" he shouted with his powerful voice. Harry's name echoed and re-echoed among the rocks, and finally died away in the depths of the shaft. Ryan rapidly ascended the upper ladders and returned to the light of day. Without losing a moment, he reached the Callander station, just caught the express to Edinburgh, and by 3 o'clock was before the Lord Provost. There his declaration was received. His account was given so clearly that it could not be doubted. Sir William Elphiston, president of the Royal Institution, and not only colleague, but a personal friend of Starr's, was also informed and asked to direct the search which was to be made without delay in the mine. Several men were placed at his disposal, supplied with lamps, picks, long rope ladders, not forgetting provisions and cordials. Then, guided by Jack Ryan, the party set out for the Aberfoil mines. The same evening the expedition arrived at the opening of the Yarrow shaft, and descended to the 27th landing, at which Jack Ryan had been stopped a few hours previously. The lamps, fastened to long ropes, were lowered down the shaft, and it was thus ascertained that the 4 last ladders were wanting. As soon as the lamps had been brought up, the men fixed to the landing a rope ladder, which unrolled itself down the shaft, and all descended one after the other. Jack Ryan's descent was the most difficult, for he went first down the swinging ladders and fastened them for the others. The space at the bottom of the shaft was completely deserted, but Sir William was much surprised at hearing Jack Ryan exclaim, "Here are bits of the ladders, and some of them half burnt." "Burnt?" repeated Sir William. "Indeed, here sure enough are cinders, which have evidently been coaled a long time." "Do you think, sir," asked Ryan, "that Mr. Starr could have had any reason for burning the ladders and thus breaking of communication with the world?" "Certainly not," answered Sir William Elphiston, who had become very thoughtful. "Come, my lad, lead us to the cottage. There we shall ascertain the truth." Jack Ryan shook his head, as if not at all convinced. Then, taking a lamp from the hands of one of the men, he proceeded with a rapid step along the principal passage of the Dockart pit. The others all followed him. In a quarter of an hour the party arrived at the excavation in which stood Simon Ford's cottage. There was no light in the window. Ryan darted to the door and threw it open. The house was empty. They examined all the rooms in the sombre habitation. No trace of violence was to be found. All was in order, as if old Madge had been still there. There was even an ample supply of provisions, enough to last the Ford family for several days. The absence of the tenants of the cottage was quite unaccountable, but was it not possible to find out the exact time they had quitted it? Yes, for in this region, where there was no difference of day or night, Madge was accustomed to mark with a cross each day in her almanac. The almanac was pinned up on the wall, and there the last cross had been made at the 6th of December, that is to say, a day after the arrival of James Starr, to which Ryan could positively swear. It was clear that on the 6th of December, 10 days ago, Simon Ford, his wife, son, and guest, had quitted the cottage. Could a fresh exploration of the mine, undertaken by the engineer, account for such a long absence? Certainly not. It was intensely dark all round. The lamps held by the men gave light only just where they were standing. Suddenly, Jack Ryan uttered a cry. "Look there! There!" His finger was pointing to a tolerably bright light which was moving about in the distance. "After that light, my men!" exclaimed Sir William. "It's a goblin light," said Ryan. "So what's the use? We shall never catch it." The president and his men, little given to superstition, darted off in the direction of the moving light. Jack Ryan, bravely following their example, quickly overtook the headmost of the party. It was a long and fatiguing chase. The lantern seemed to be carried by a being of small size, but singular agility. Every now and then it disappeared behind some pillar, then was seen again at the end of a cross gallery. A sharp turn would place it out of sight, and it seemed to have completely disappeared, when all at once there would be the light as bright as ever. However, they gained very little on it, and Ryan's belief that they could never catch it seemed far from groundless. After an hour of this vain pursuit, Sir William Elphiston and his companions had gone a long way in the southwest direction of the pit, and began to think they really had to do with an impalpable being. Just then it seemed as if the distance between the goblin and those who were pursuing it was becoming less. Could it be fatigued, or did this invisible being wish to entice Sir William and his companions to the place where the inhabitants of the cottage had perhaps themselves been enticed? It was hard to say. The men, seeing that the distance lessened, redoubled their efforts. The light, which had before burnt at a distance of more than 200 feet before them, was now seen at less than 50. The space continued to diminish. The bearer of the lamp became partially visible. Sometimes, when it turned its head, the indistinct profile of a human face could be made out, and unless a sprite could assume bodily shape, Jack Ryan was obliged to confess that here was no supernatural being. Then, springing forward, "Courage, comrades!" he exclaimed. "It is getting tired. We shall soon catch it up now, and if it can talk as well as it can run, we shall hear a fine story." But the pursuit had suddenly become more difficult. They were in unknown regions of the mine. Narrow passages crossed each other like the windings of a labyrinth. The bearer of the lamp might escape them as easily as possible by just extinguishing the light and retreating into some dark refuge. And indeed, thought Sir William, if it wishes to avoid us, why does it not do so? Hitherto there had evidently been no intention to avoid them, but just as the thought crossed Sir William's mind, the light suddenly disappeared, and the party, continuing the pursuit, found themselves before an extremely narrow natural opening in the schistous rocks. To trim their lamps, spring forward, and dart through the opening was for Sir William and his party but the work of an instant. But before they had gone 100 paces along this new gallery, much wider and loftier than the former, they all stopped short. There, near the wall, lay 4 bodies, stretched on the ground, 4 corpses, perhaps. "James Starr!" exclaimed Sir William Elphiston. "Harry! Harry!" cried Ryan, throwing himself down beside his friend. It was indeed the engineer, Madge, Simon, and Harry Ford, who were lying there motionless. But one of the bodies moved slightly, and Madge's voice was heard faintly murmuring, "See to the others. Help them first." Sir William, Jack, and their companions endeavoured to reanimate the engineer and his friends by getting them to swallow a few drops of brandy. They very soon succeeded. The unfortunate people, shut up in that dark cavern for 10 days, were dying of starvation. They must have perished had they not on 3 occasions found a loaf of bread and a jug of water set near them. No doubt the charitable being to whom they owed their lives was unable to do more for them. Sir William wondered whether this might not have been the work of the strange sprite who had allured them to the very spot where James Starr and his companions lay. However that might be, the engineer, Madge, Simon, and Harry Ford were saved. They were assisted to the cottage, passing through the narrow opening which the bearer of the strange light had apparently wished to point out to Sir William. This was a natural opening. The passage which James Starr and his companions had made for themselves with dynamite had been completely blocked up with rocks laid one upon another. So then, whilst they had been exploring the vast cavern, the way back had been purposely closed against them by a hostile hand. Chapter 10. Coal Town. 3 years after the events which have just been related, the guidebooks recommended as a great attraction to the numerous tourists who roam over the county of Stirling a visit of a few hours to the mines of New Aberfoil. No mine in any country, either in the Old or New World, could present a more curious aspect. To begin with, the visitor was transported without danger or fatigue to a level with the workings, at 1,500 feet below the surface of the ground. 7 miles to the southwest of Callander opened a slanting tunnel, adorned with a castellated entrance, turrets, and battlements. This lofty tunnel gently sloped straight to the stupendous crypt, hollowed out so strangely in the bowels of the earth. A double line of railway, the wagons being moved by hydraulic power, plied from hour to hour to and from the village thus buried in the subsoil of the county, and which bore the rather ambitious title of Coal Town. Arrived in Coal Town, the visitor found himself in a place where electricity played a principal part as an agent of heat and light. Although the ventilation shafts were numerous, they were not sufficient to admit much daylight into New Aberfoil, yet it had abundance of light. This was shed from numbers of electric discs, some suspended from the vaulted roofs, others hanging on the natural pillars. All, whether suns or stars in size, were fed by continuous currents produced from electromagnetic machines. When the hour of rest arrived, an artificial night was easily produced all over the mine by disconnecting the wires. Below the dome lay a lake of an extent to be compared to the Dead Sea of the Mammoth Caves, a deep lake whose transparent waters swarmed with eyeless fish, and to which the engineer gave the name of Loch Malcolm. There, in this immense natural excavation, Simon Ford built his new cottage, which he would not have exchanged for the finest house in Princes Street, Edinburgh. This dwelling was situated on the shores of the loch, and its 5 windows looked out on the dark waters, which extended further than the eye could see. 2 months later, a second habitation was erected in the neighbourhood of Simon Ford's cottage. This was for James Starr. The engineer had given himself body and soul to New Aberfoil, and nothing but the most imperative necessity ever caused him to leave the pit. There, then, he lived in the midst of his mining world. On the discovery of the new field, all the old colliers had hastened to leave the plough and harrow and resume the pick and mattock. Attracted by the certainty that work would never fail, allured by the high wages which the prosperity of the mine enabled the company to offer for labour, they deserted the open air for an underground life and took up their abode in the mines. The miners' houses, built of brick, soon grew up in a picturesque fashion, some on the banks of Loch Malcolm, others under the arches which seemed made to resist the weight that pressed upon them, like the piers of a bridge. So was founded Coal Town, situated under the eastern point of Loch Katrina, to the north of the county of Stirling. It was a regular settlement on the banks of Loch Malcolm. A chapel, dedicated to St. Giles, overlooked it from the top of a huge rock, whose foot was laved by the waters of the subterranean sea. When this underground town was lighted up by the bright rays thrown from the discs, hung from the pillars and arches, its aspect was so strange, so fantastic, that it justified the praise of the guidebooks, and visitors flocked to see it. It is needless to say that the inhabitants of Coal Town were proud of their place. They rarely left their labouring village, in that imitating Simon Ford, who never wished to go out again. The old overman maintained that it always rained up there, and, considering the climate of the United Kingdom, it must be acknowledged that he was not far wrong. All the families in New Aberfoil prospered well, having in 3 years obtained a certain competency which they could never have hoped to attain on the surface of the county. Dozens of babies, who were born at the time when the works were resumed, had never yet breathed the outer air. This made Jack Ryan remark, "It's 18 months since they were weaned, and they have not yet seen daylight." It may be mentioned here that one of the first to run at the engineer's call was Jack Ryan. The merry fellow had thought it his duty to return to his old trade, but though Melrose Farm had lost singer and piper, it must not be thought that Jack Ryan sung no more. On the contrary, the sonorous echoes of New Aberfoil exerted their strong lungs to answer him. Jack Ryan took up his abode in Simon Ford's new cottage. They offered him a room, which he accepted without ceremony, in his frank and hearty way. Old Madge loved him for his fine character and good nature. She in some degree shared his ideas on the subject of the fantastic beings who were supposed to haunt the mine, and the two, when alone, told each other stories wild enough to make one shudder, stories well worthy of enriching the Hyperborean mythology. Jack thus became the life of the cottage. He was, besides being a jovial companion, a good workman. 6 months after the works had begun, he was made head of a gang of hewers. "That was a good work done, Mr. Ford," said he, a few days after his appointment. "You discovered a new field, and though you narrowly escaped paying for the discovery with your life, well, it was not too dearly bought." "No, Jack, it was a good bargain we made that time," answered the old overman. "But neither Mr. Starr nor I have forgotten that to you we owe our lives." "Not at all," returned Jack. "You owe them to your son Harry, when he had the good sense to accept my invitation to Irvine." "And not to go, isn't that it?" interrupted Harry, grasping his comrade's hand. "No, Jack, it is to you, scarcely healed of your wounds, to you, who did not delay a day, no, nor an hour, that we owe our being found still alive in the mine." "Rubbish, no," broke in the obstinate fellow. "I won't have that said, when it's no such thing. I hurried to find out what had become of you, Harry, that's all. But to give everyone his due, I will add that, without that unapproachable goblin—" "Ah, there we are," cried Ford. "A goblin!" "A goblin, a brownie, a fairy's child," repeated Jack Ryan. "A cousin of the Fire Maidens, an Urisk, whatever you like. It's not the less certain that without it we should never have found our way into the gallery from which you could not get out." "No doubt, Jack," answered Harry. "It remains to be seen whether this being was as supernatural as you choose to believe." "Supernatural," exclaimed Ryan. "But it was as supernatural as a will-o'-the-wisp, who may be seen skipping along with his lantern in his hand. You may try to catch him, but he escapes like a fairy and vanishes like a shadow. Don't be uneasy, Harry. We shall see it again some day or other. Well, Jack, said Simon Ford, will-o'-the-wisp or not, we shall try to find it, and you must help us. You'll get into a scrap if you don't take care, Mr. Ford, responded Jack Ryan. We'll see about that, Jack. We may easily imagine how soon this domain of New Aberfoil became familiar to all the members of the Ford family, but more particularly to Harry. He learnt to know all its most secret ins and outs. He could even say what point of the surface corresponded with what point of the mine. He knew that above this seam lay the Firth of Clyde, that there extended Loch Lomond and Loch Katrina. Those columns supported a spur of the Grampian Mountains. This vault served as a basement to Dumbarton. Above this large pond passed the Balloch Railway. Here ended the Scottish coast. There began the sea, the tumult of which could be distinctly heard during the equinoctial gales. Harry would have been a first-rate guide to these natural catacombs, and all that alpine guides do on their snowy peaks in daylight he could have done in the dark mine by the wonderful power of instinct. He loved New Aberfoil. Many times, with his lamp stuck in his hat, did he penetrate its furthest depths. He explored its ponds in a skillfully managed canoe. He even went shooting, for numerous birds had been introduced into the crypt. Pintails, snipes, ducks, who fed on the fish which swarmed in the deep waters. Harry's eyes seemed made for the dark, just as a sailor's are made for distances. But all this while Harry felt irresistibly animated by the hope of finding the mysterious being whose intervention, strictly speaking, had saved himself and his friends. Would he succeed? He certainly would, if presentiments were to be trusted, but certainly not if he judged by the success which had as yet attended his researches. The attacks directed against the family of the old overman, before the discovery of New Aberfoil, had not been renewed.